Self-defense. A classic example of justification is self-defense. The general principle is if you harm or even kill an attacker, your conduct is justifiable because your true intention is to protect yourself, not to inflict harm. Now, there are 5 elements to self-defense. 1. You're acting reasonably. 2. You believe you're in imminent danger. 3. The harm you're defending against is unlawful. 4. Your response is equal to the threat. And 5. You have no other option but force. There is a castle exception. When you are in your home, you are the king of your castle/home, and there is no legal requirement to retreat or escape. States have different laws because of the principle of federalism. Excuse. The fundamentals of excuse. Even though the act was wrong, special circumstances make it unfair to punish the defendant. They make the act excusable. Mistake or ignorance of law is not excusable. Mistake of fact is excusable. Now, duress is excusable, which means compelled to commit a criminal act because you were faced with the threat of unlawful force. For example, I'm going to evict your grandmother is unlawful, not duress. Entrapment is a legal excuse defense, rarely works. The government agent of the state attempts to induce you into committing a crime, and this must be a continuous threat. All these examples are excusable because even a person acting reasonably could succumb to them. Mistake of fact, duress, and entrapment, which, by the way, is rare. Other excuse defenses are based on the idea that there is something wrong with the ability of the defendant to act reasonably. For example, insanity, which means something is wrong with the mental capacities, for example, psychosis. There is also diminished capacity, which is intellectual disability. Cognitively impaired typically reduces the crime to a lesser charge. There are other conditions affecting the mental state that can form the basis for an excuse defense in some states. For example, battered persons syndrome. A history of abuse can change the way they perceive the world. Expanded excuse defenses like BPS show that what is reasonable depends on your perspective, what is shaped by your experience. Reasonable victim of toxic stress. Reasonable victim of early infancy neglect. Rationally is highly contextual. It's difficult to draw the line. Rationality is central in American law. Let's look at prosecution. There are 4 elements to prove a prosecution. 1 is actus reus, which is the defendant commits an act of human conduct, not just thoughts. Being something is not Speech is conduct. Being something is not. For some being a gangster. Failure to do something, reasonable, may constitute criminal conduct. For example, Pears was accused of negligent homicide. Number 2 is mens rea, which means guilty mind. The defendant intends to do the act. Mens rea is not a motive, which is not a required element of crime. Motive may be relevant to imply guilty intent. Specific intent crimes involve conscious, deliberate planning to achieve a certain result, which is a requirement of crimes in the first degree. For example, a handwritten note showing plans for murder. General intent refers to crimes that lack this specific proof and are instead inferred from other conduct. For example, breaking into a home implies the intent to burglarize it. There is also constructive intent, which is the lack of actual intention of harm, but they're punished anyway because the defendant should have known that would very likely have caused harm. A reasonably prudent person would not have acted that way. For example, driving 80 miles an hour in a school zone, putting a loaded gun on a table where children are. Constructive intent is mens rea. Number 3 is concurrence. Concurrence refers to the act and the state of mind occur at the same time. Intent propels the act. For example, Billy threatens to kill his brother, but they make up. Billy accidentally shoots his brother. No concurrence. Number 4 is causation. Causation refers to the act results in harm. Criminal law uses the but-for standard. The harm would not have resulted but for the defendant's act. The harm has to be reasonably foreseeable. Had the defendant not committed these actions, the harm would not have resulted. For example, pulling the trigger results in a dead body. Murder. 1. Actus reus. This is an unlawful act of violence. 2. Mens rea. There are 2 main categories: first-degree murder and second-degree murder. First-degree murder requires malice, which is a specific intent to take another's life without excuse or justification. This requires premeditation, a period of reflection between the initial intent and the actual deed. Second-degree murder generally has malice but no premeditation. Felony murder is a special kind of homicide, often associated with second-degree murder. For example, someone commits an armed robbery without the intent to hurt, they get nervous and shoot someone. Felony murder. Manslaughter. Killings without malice. There's no provocation. Number 3 is concurrence. For first-degree murder, malice combined with premeditation propels the act of violence. Second-degree murder does the same without premeditation. And for causation, an act of violence results in a dead body. Why do people hurt and kill each other? Rational choice theory is the prevailing explanation for violent crime. People commit violence because they find the benefits outweigh the costs. Perhaps they let the devil get into them. Logical consequence, more punishment. Rigorous scientific and criminological research associates violence with positivist factors of nature combined with nurture. The law strives for simplicity, attempts to attribute conduct to rational choice. Reality is messy. Law is conflicted about what reasonable is. Addiction. Mental health problems lead to self-medication. There is also developmental disorders and constant exposure plus stress. Maybe people decide rationally to become addicts. There are some benefits. High feels good, you look cool, you develop camaraderie, friendship with others. It's a thrill to break the law. But there are some costs. You become a junkie, you get arrested, convicted, and you have to serve time. You do stupid things, you endanger people you care about, you get looked down on and ostracized. Hot glass, for example. Dad guy Michael is a cool guy. He started drinking young. Drinking was woven into the family dynamic. However, he was known as the straightest of straight arrows in prep school. He used alcohol to pound his nerves into submission. His dad was a bad drunk. He states nothing has given him relief like alcohol. Why do some people become addicts but others not? There are three main reasons. 1. Substantial overlap between addiction and problems with mental health. Mood disorders, anxiety disorders, personality disorders, childhood abuse, and neglect. For these people, addiction is the result of attempts at self-medication. Mentally ill seek substances that affect the same brain circuits impaired by their mental illness. These substances often make their mental health worse. Depression and anxiety could lead to alcohol and other sedatives. Narcissism could lead to cocaine and stimulants. Power and confidence. Number 2 is developmental disorders, which cause blunted reward systems in the brain. Number 3 is constant exposure, which can make people hooked, especially when surrounded by an environment characterized by stress. Stress can contribute to addictions in the above two categories, those involving mental health problems and those involving developmental impairment. The difference between people who get hooked on drugs and people who aren't affected is from nature and nurture. Michael's path, for example. Anxiety disorder and psychological abuse lead to intense stress, constant exposure, and affirmation for addictive behavior. Possible genetic disorder? Drug dealers. Let's take a look at drug dealing. The majority of drug dealers are low-level hustlers with no desire to rise within the ranks of organized crime. Many of them have never been arrested or don't carry guns. They work hard and they don't make much. According to economic research, between 20 to 30K. Working a minimum wage job puts people at the mercy of a system that will ruthlessly replace them if they break any of its rules. For the benefits of drug dealing, you can afford to get by, feeding your family, house, gas, and travel. You get some autonomy and self-respect. But there are costs of drug dealing. You get arrested, convicted, and you have to serve time. You endanger people you care about, you get beat up, and you're looked down on by others. For some people, being able to live with dignity is worth it. What's the point of surviving if you can't live? Choice is relevant to crime. What do you perceive your choices to be are shaped by your surroundings and context. Prohibition. In the 1920s, a national ban on the sale of alcohol led to the rise of organized crime syndicates that dealt in bootleg liquor. Al Capone is a figure who established extensive ties with government and law enforcement officials. Corruption plus violence plus resentment at high liquor prices resulted in the repeal. Thank you.